Hi, welcome to Book Chat with You. I'm Matt Hernandez, and in this and almost every episode, I try to make this be a conversation with you about literature. Let me try to start off with the synopsis. So we're looking at a short story by Charles W Chestnut, The Sheriff's Children. So I'll try to give you a synopsis first. So this story, it has quite a difficult writing style. The writing style quite reminds me of Sherman Anderson's Hands. And in the story, it kind of starts off with a kind of a setting or kind of an exposition, if you will, but the writing style is very much tell, which not something wrong with it, but very much different than a kind of show writing style. And in this story, it starts off with a Captain Walker, a beloved Civil War veteran, having been murdered. Now they're all blaming one man, and I don't even know the terms to use nowadays. I'd imagine that I would say Black American many times, I imagine, but the story uses the term Negro and mulatto. So if I use those terms, I'm going based off the text and how I'm following this. I don't even know, I've been outside the US for so long, I have to relearn these things, right? So they all blame a mulatto man or the mob. A mob blames, and this is inside of North Carolina, a supposedly very conservative, a made up yet very conservative county in North Carolina. And they're all blaming this one mulatto man, which we don't even initially get his name. Now, as some of this news comes to Sheriff Campbell, and not only as the news comes to him, but also a bit of a warning, another man, a free man, goes to their house. His name's Sam, and he tells the sheriff, please rush over to the jail. And I'm not going to stay here and chat with you too long. I'm not going to the jail, but please rush over to the jail before this man gets lynched. Because the mob, as they work themselves up more into a frenzy, they're considering just lynching the mulatto man and getting it over with and just skipping any kind of trial. So as the sheriff has a nice conversation with Sam, he says, well, my daughter can send you some food on the way home, which is a nice gesture, and it shows a bit of moral and character ambiguity and complexity, which I would get into in a little bit. So whenever the sheriff gets to his jail, he tries to calm down the crowd. He tries to have them leave. Whenever he goes up to the second floor of the jail, he looks outside, and it seems that they're leaving. Now, somehow in all this, the prisoner was able to quietly, because the sheriff was distracted, to take his firearm, shoot a warning shot, and they have a very tense conversation. The sheriff begins to sort of let the prisoner go. As they have a conversation, it turns out that the prisoner is the sheriff's son. Now, especially in this era, that's a very big thing. If it was nowadays, it's always kind of cliche, right? In stories, somehow the characters are related and they don't expect it. I bet this has been going on maybe for a super long time in stories, but we can all think of like Star Wars or something. So somehow within some of the commotion, his daughter, Sheriff Campbell's daughter, had heard the shot. She rushes in. Now you got to go keep in mind, if the prisoner is the sheriff's son, the sheriff didn't recognize him at first. The prisoner reminds the sheriff about the prisoner's mother, Cece, which the sheriff sold. And even what the story had mentioned twice is that the sheriff, when he was once a slaveholder, he could have always just have saved up enough money, given his son some money, and sent him to a free state and just said, whatever, this is a horrible circumstance, but just get on with your life as a free man in the North with some cash, right? He didn't even bother to do that. And yeah, so when his daughter arrives at the jail, she doesn't really know what's going on, and she shoots the prisoner. Now, the sheriff uses a tourniquet and tries to keep his son Tom alive until the morning. Now you can guess what happens from there. There's only a few paragraphs left, and yeah, it's quite interesting. But the story does raise a lot of these moral questions and a lot of this discussion, and a lot for people who are with this moral ambiguity. What could that mean and all that stuff, Now, another thing that I think about saying is that, I recorded, and I probably put it up soon, a discussion about Ernest Hemingway's The Short, Happy Life of Francis Macomber. Now, what I find interesting with these is that for people who say that they're reading a lot, making a lot of book reviews, discussing a lot of this stuff, single stories like this would have so many hours, yes, hours of research needed to go into these things in depth. I mean, this story alone, there's so much that I would not be able to get into, and I'm not really pretending to, but, you know, to act as if I were would be quite insincere because there's really a lot going on here. Okay, so I chose a few places here to read from the text. Now, I cannot do these accents and dialects very well, but I will try a little bit. So it says, Sheriff, they're going to hang the prisoner who's locked up in the jail. They're coming this way now. I was laying down on a sack of corn when I came down behind the floor barrels, when I heard Doc Kane and Colonel Wright talk about it. I slipped out of the back and ran here as fast as I could. I heard you say that once that you wouldn't let a prisoner for who over your dead body. And I thought I'd let you know so someday I come over here so you could protect the prisoner. The funny thing also with this is that if you listen to somebody else read this, and I found a very good reading of the story, the accent, the dialect comes out very, very clear. I cannot do it, though. I cannot do it. Not just because I'm a little tired or not just because of my stutter. I still am not sure I can do it. The sheriff listened calmly, but his face grew firmer and a determined gleam lit up his gray eyes. His frame grew more erect, and he unconsciously assumed the attitude of a soldier who momentarily expects to meet the enemy face to face. Much obliged, Sam, he answered. I'll protect the prisoner. Who's coming? I don't know who all is coming, replied the Negro. There's Mr. McSwain and Doc Kane and McDonnell and Colonel Wright and a heap of others. I was so scared I forgot half of them. I suspect there's more here by this time, so I'll get out of the way. Okay, it continues. Won't you come and have some dinner first? Asked the sheriff. The Negro looked longingly at the open door and sniffed the appetizing odor of boiled pork and collards. I ain't got no time for that, Sheriff. But 'tis Nance mote give me. I'm sorry. A moment later, Nancy brought up a huge sandwich and split corn pone with a thick slice of fat bacon inserted between the halves and a couple of baked yams. The Negro hastily replaced his ragged hat on his head, dropped the yams in the pocket of his capacious trousers, and taking the sandwich in his hand, hurried off the road and disappeared in the woods beyond. The sheriff re-entered his house and put on his coat. He then took down a double-barreled shotgun and loaded it with buckshot. Filling the chambers of a revolver with fresh cartridges, he slipped it into the pocket of his sack coat, of which he wore. Yeah, well, I can quite embarrass myself by trying to read part of that, but the point that I was trying to get to is that you do get a bit of this moral ambiguity later on. How does a man sell his own son, even despite, I mean, he could seem to be a kind enough man. I mean, it's not to say that he's friends with everybody of every ethnic group or something like that, of every race or something, but at least in situations like this, he's kind and professional and that type of thing. Now, as we go on, is that what we saw from his past? Okay. So later on in the story, when his son Tom forces the sheriff up the stairs inside of his own prison and they have a conversation, but Tom wants to escape. Keeping the sheriff under the cover of the revolver, the mulatto followed him up the stairs. The sheriff expected the prisoner to lock him into the cell and make his own escape. He had about come to the conclusion that the best thing he could do under the circumstances was to submit quietly and take his chances of recapturing the prisoner after the alarm had been given. The sheriff had faced death more than once on the battlefield. A few minutes before, well armed and with a brick wall between him and them. He had dared 100 men to fight, but he felt instinctively that the desperate man confronting him was not to be trifled with, and that he was too prudent a man to risk his life against such heavy odds. He had Polly to look after, and there was a limit beyond which devotion to duty would be quixotic and even foolish. I want to get away, said the prisoner, and I don't want to be captured, for if I am, I know I will be hung on the spot. I'm afraid, he added, and somewhat reflectively, that in order to save myself, I shall have to kill you. Good God, replied the sheriff in involuntary terror. You would not kill the man of whom you owe your life. You speak more truly than you know, replied the mulatto. I indeed owe my life to you. So, but there's a whole thing here where the townspeople respect the sheriff. And so they said that they do not want to cause harm to him specifically because, they have some adoration for the guy. But the sheriff, not knowing his connection to his own son, and it goes on here, the sheriff started. He was capable of surprise, even in that moment of extreme peril. Who are you? He asked in amazement. Tom Cicely's son, returned the other, and he opened the door and stood talking to the sheriff through the gated opening. So when you listen to this, which somebody else has read this much, much better than I have, you will really get the sense of emotion that some of this stuff is trying to convey. Don't you remember Cicely? Cicely, of whom you sold her child to the speculator on his way to Alabama? The sheriff did remember. He had been sorry for it many a time since, and it had been the story of debts, mortgages, and bad crops. He quarreled with the mother. The price offered for her and her child had been unusually large, and he had yielded to the combination of anger and pecuniary stress. Good God, he gasped. You would not murder your own father. My father, replied the mulatto. It were well enough for me to claim the relationship, but it comes with poor grace in anything by reason of it. So when you think about this, imagine this. There's almost something funny about it, but even that one word would then make me have trouble sleeping for like the next week to having said it. But it's quite interesting, right? I mean, to get into such an argument with one that somebody has slept with. I don't know how you can call this kind of relationship. Could you call it boyfriend, girlfriend? I don't know. But to then have financial issues, quarrel with somebody, and then sell them. That is such a crazy, crazy thing to imagine now, isn't it? And yeah. Oh, one more thing. Maybe I should have led with this. But another detail which I'm not familiar with this author, I'm actually going to read something off of Wikipedia. Early life. Chestnut was born in Cleveland, Ohio to Andrew Jackson Chestnut and Anne Maria Chestnut, both free persons of color, in Fayetteville, North Carolina. His paternal grandfather was known to be a white slaveholder. He considered himself to be an African American, acknowledging additionally 7/8 white. Given his appearance and background, Chestnut could pass as a white man and could have been legally permitted to claim said status and never chose to do so. By the 1920s, the one-drop rule was formally codified into law in many southern states, officially classifying him as a Negro on account of his known ancestry. So when you look at this, when you look at a picture of him, and then when you read the story, you read whatever, and then you look this up, it's quite interesting how somebody might, be 1/8 of an ethnicity and all that. Now, I'm trying to parse from every word and I should feel more open. I want to have a conversation, and maybe I'm betraying that whole concept. But, to be labeled one thing, to be forced that thing, regardless of our own choice, our own circumstance, our own appearance, our own upbringing, our own education, and then given the worst label of it. I mean, my kids, for instance, are just about every ethnicity. They're part, well, I guess, white, Caucasian, a bit Spanish, a bit Filipino, a bit Samoan, a bit Chinese. But imagine if in whatever people's perception of that, whatever the worst of anything could be, they're labeled as, regardless of their desire, regardless of whatever. And I mean, it's not to say that any race or something is good, bad, whatever. We just are, and whatever. But just imagine that. Imagine Charles W Chestnut could almost see ahead and just, he feels for one thing, he feels for one belonging. And later on, for whatever it is, they codify this rule. And I'm not going to look up when this rule was codified, when the story was written, when all these other things that happened. But it all is a quite fascinating thing. And to do these stories properly, I might sometimes demand that. But maybe I don't know. It is all quite a fascinating thing. And it would all be hours and hours of discussion to have with others and such. So with all that said, I'd love to hear what you think about all these things, because in ways I have thoughts and I have not done a good enough job of formulating all of them together, but that's not exactly my point. It is, but it isn't. And well, have a wonderful day. Bye.